Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. And for some of you won't know that this evening we're having a reception afterwards, which was, I think, part of your ticket information. But we also are combining it with a reception for the opening of Nikki Jabora Barber, a printmaker from Seattle, the opening of her exhibition. We had a great 3-week run with our Dia de los Muertos, an annual huge community celebration involving adult contemporary artists and also a lot of kids' artwork from the local schools, and 2 big ceremony days. And we've ended that, and now we will be showing Nikki's work and continuing with Dennis and Nancy into February. So we invite you to the reception. It'll be in the galleries on the first floor. I'll ask you to not bring food and drink upstairs to Nancy and Dennis's show. And this is being recorded. I'm sure you'll all have friends and family who want to wish they were here today, but it will be recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel probably in a couple of weeks. I am not going to say very many words of introduction about Nancy and Dennis because they have one of the most comprehensive presentations, and their work is so complicated and intriguing and so interesting that I'll just let them talk about that. What I would like to say is I've known them since the 1990s, probably mid-1990s, when I was the executive director of Pratt Fine Arts Center. And I had the pleasure of seeing some of their exhibitions. I remember one especially at Woodside Brasseth Gallery. And I was always very, very intrigued about how they could work so individually and also collaboratively. A lot of the artists that we've shown who work collaboratively, that's pretty much what they do. That's how they share their visions and build work together. This is really 3 shows in one. It's Dennis's retrospective, Nancy's retrospective, and then collaborative work also over all of these years. This has been, to some degree, a humbling experience. I feel like I've almost gotten enough credits to helping to mount this show that I almost could have a Bachelor of Arts in the Humanities, philosophy, science, astronomy, cosmology, whatever the difference is on those last 2, I don't really know. I guess I haven't. He'll tell you. And Dasha Moore is here. She's in the back. You'll meet her during the reception. She works with me in curatorial and has really helped a lot also with planning the show. And we could not have done this show without all of the help and support. And just having work already, all the crates available and things like that. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is a real gift to a small regional art museum like ours, is how much they, behind the scenes, help to support getting this show delivered and mounted. I want to thank you so much. Without further ado, I have several volunteers I'm going to toddle off with and get your reception ready. Thank you for being here.
We're gonna.
Really, how we're gonna do this? There's 1 clicker and 2 mics.
Here you go. So
And we are the Bickersons.
we're gonna, as he said, he wonders how we work together. You're going to see that in the next 50 minutes because we're continually correcting one another and bickering, and then we agree at some point in that. So we're gonna take you on a 50-year journey of our marriage, our life as artists, and maybe a little glimpse into the future. So here we go, 50 minutes and 50 years.
Originally, there was gonna be a laptop here, but my images were so big that they crashed the laptop. So we're gonna go back and forth to the screen.
So we've met 50 years ago, and here we are. Let's hope this progresses forward.
Can we punch the slides for you in the back? Here, let us do it.
Okay, you guys go.
That's gonna be complicated.
Yeah, we made some huge slides that are choking your system a little bit.
Next slide.
Okay, we're going to go back and forth between Dennis and Nancy. And since I'm the older one, we start in 1946 when I was born. And I have my father and mother. I had a brother and a sister and me in the middle with the striped shirt. And I went to Catholic schools. It was a Catholic family. And these are the formative years for me. It was a French Catholic family, blue collar. I attended Catholic schools, no art. Small Jesuit boys' school, Marquette High School, no art. I went to Seattle University for 1 year, Jesuit school, no art. Transferred to the University of Washington and studied chemistry, pre-med, no art. And then I won the Richard Nixon lottery in 1969 and spent 2 years in the Marine Corps, no art. However, during the Marine Corps, I decided to do some land art. That's me, Corporal Evans, sitting in a piece of land art I did out in the desert. And I almost went to jail for that because they thought I was digging holes for putting bodies in. Anyway, so there was some art there. So I had an epiphany in the Marine Corps, and I returned home and began to study pottery with a woman in Yakima who lived in an orchard. This is like a Joseph Campbell fairy tale. I would go to her house after work and started throwing pots. And after 2 weeks with her, I came to her door and she grabbed me by my cheeks and she said, "Dennis, you're an artist. Go study art, get some training." So I was in Yakima at the time, and I drove up to Ellensburg at Central Washington University and enrolled, and I already had a college degree in chemistry, and I studied sculpture with a guy named Christos Papadopoulos. And after 2 terms with him, he called me in his office and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I have no idea." And he also didn't quite grab me by my cheeks, but he said, "Dennis, you're an artist. Go back to Washington, get some training. You're an artist." So I went back to Seattle, got into the art school, and got a Bachelor of Fine Arts in ceramics and then a Master of Fine Arts in the universe. And there's where I met this woman, Nancy Mee. You can see why I fell in love with her in 1974. Okay, now
So
you're
do I
gonna
click through then?
try it. You got to point back there when you click. All right.
Okay, so here's my family. My mom, dad, me in the middle, my brother, and my little baby sister, Catherine. There I am on my baptismal day. We were baptized late in life. We were Episcopalians. There was no hurry to do it. We knew we weren't going to go to heaven anyway, so. And then there I am at my graduation in University of Washington, 1974. Mind you, my mother gave me 17 albums filled with my pictures, and every one of them has been labeled on the top with whoever's in it. And she would send that picture to anyone that was in the picture. So there was no compositional integrity in my mom's pictures because there was always a huge label right at the top. So, oh, sorry, wrong way. So I was born in the Bay Area. My mom and dad, I was born in Oakland, California. My dad was with a Chevron, and we moved around just like the Army. Didn't believe you should stay in any place for more than a few years. So I ended up in Sacramento, of which I then went to high school at St. Francis. There was no, at the time it was one high school in Sacramento, and it was the midst of the Watts riots. And my parents thought it was either go away to school or find something a little safer. So it turns out there was a Catholic high school right in my neighborhood. So I went to there, and I was supposed to go to Berkeley at some point teacher of mine had said, oh, you should go to UW, it's a much better art program. So off I came to University of Washington in 1969, and I studied painting. I did a sort of fast course through the first 4 years I did in 3 years, and I tell people it wasn't that I was smart, it's just art was really easy. So I took a year off and had an independent study in Paris, and I studied with a very famous printmaker, Stanley Hayter, in 1970. No, we got the wrong right. 72, 73. They returned to UW in 73, which I then met Dennis Evans, who had taken my teaching assistant job I thought I deserved, and our mutual professor gave it to him, and he didn't know where that cute girl was that he'd seen in the pictures, and wondered about the Chinese girl that was studying in Paris, where she was. So here we are when we first met, and I don't know why we put this in here. Anyway, there's Dennis. My parents couldn't stand him. They thought he looked like Charles Manson, so. So there we are, all lovey-dovey. And here we are. Okay, your turn.
You both. So during that time, we were in school and supporting ourselves, and I had a ceramic degree, and so we made pots, hand-built pots together, and we showed them at the Bellevue Arts and Crafts Fair. And so for 3 summers, we made pots and sold them, and we would make $5,000 in a weekend, which was a lot of money at that time of year, at that time of the America. And we used that money eventually to put down on a house that we bought in Northeast Seattle, which we still live in 50 years later. We've added on to it twice. So it originally started as an 800 square foot Seattle bungalow.
HUD house. It was abandoned. Dogs were living in it.
And we basically bought it making art. And so it was a great way to start this life that we have.
So this is the work I was doing from 1971 to 1980. How we organized this show, our talk today is in decades. So it is very, fast forward through a lot of work and very small representation of individual pieces. So this is, on my left-hand side was a painting that I did prior to going to Paris. The painting on the right actually was also prior going to Paris. And this silk screen in the middle was done after Paris. So here I am in Paris, which was a really seminal part of my education. I went just sort of as a gadfly and actually realized that I had been sheltered in this incredibly privileged world all of my life, and it was an opportunity at that time to actually meet people who didn't speak English and eat food that I would never have eaten at home, and I drank really, really cheap wine and smoked Gauloise cigarettes daily. Anyway, okay.
So important is this middle picture of her with a camera. Because when we started dating, I guess we'll call it dating in the...
It was dating. We weren't married.
Anyway, you're going to see in a minute that my work was performance work. And the reason this camera is important is that Nancy carried a camera all the time with her. And the early performance work that I did from 1974 to 1980 was documented by Nancy, because very often I would be out someplace with nobody else except her. And so the documentation that's in the show was all Nancy's work. And that's very important, because had she not been a shutterbug, which she got from her mother, my early history wouldn't exist.
And the irony is that I actually could focus a camera. It was the old-fashioned single reflex cameras, and I was notoriously really not very good photographer, but it looks good now. So the piece on the right is one of my very first more mature works. It was done at Stanley Hayter's studio in Paris. I don't know how fast we go here. Okay. So I wanted to show these drawings because very few people ever recognize that actually I was a really devoted draftsman. So obviously this is out of school and there's no longer great studios at your access or equipment or any material. So I started doing what was easiest. I drew myself, which was always my hand. So I started doing these drawings and doing Xerox transfers and photo transfers, which was the beginning of my very early interest in the body as an inspiration. Sorry, oops. And this is, long story short, I got a job in my 5th year of doing Xeroxing in the medical library. And at the time, they were doing a huge national study of curvature of the spine in adolescent females. And so I would be there at my job 10 or 20 hours a week Xeroxing these medical journals. And I was absolutely floored, just so upset with how coldly that young women's bodies that were deformed and obviously were sort of being exploited, I felt. And so I started putting together my own conception of what classical beauty was, Western beauty was. And here I was steeped in the training of Western art. And then by day, I was then Xeroxing these incredible images. So I started still my lifelong passion of doing the duality of perfection and deformity of what we actually expect people to look like or women to look like and what in reality is what happens or is. So this is a large drawing. So my big breakout, I was behind. I didn't go to graduate school, and all of my peers were getting their MFAs and going on and having professional careers. Well, I was given a show in a little tiny museum on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. And they had absolutely no budget. So my mom and dad and I flew over there, and I took my drawings. All the works were works on paper. And all of the sculptural elements of them, I packed into a suitcase and took the paper drawings and rolled up in a tube. When I arrived at the museum, they had 110-year-old stone walls, of which no hammer or nail could go through. So we ended up hanging them from the ceiling on boards. And the night of my opening, I have a lot of family there and cousins. The night of my opening, all of the electricity on the island went out. And here I am, my big debut. I was going to be discovered. Well, all of my relatives came. I loaded down with leis, and they came with flashlights. And that's how they saw my show, with flashlights. So this is the work I showed on Kauai, and you can see the starting of the imagery, the dual imagery. And these are the first sculptural elements that I employed in my work. I got a job out of college. I was not hireable at a restaurant or at Frederick and Nelson. They liked my style, but they said, it's just not Frederick and Nelson style, Nancy. So I couldn't get a job, and I started working for a small frame shop on University Avenue. And I started taking home little bits of glass out of the garbage bin and started assembling them and roping together and actually doing very sort of very moderate welding, or actually soldering. So these are the actual first sculptures I made for that show. And they're about 40 inches, to give you an idea. So they started out very small. And again, at this time, I had no studio. When kids get out of art school, all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, I don't have any place to work, I don't have any money to buy materials, and I don't have any time. I've got to get a job. Here we are to Dennis then. We're taking too long, we better hurry up.
We're doing fine. So that was Nancy, what she was doing from 74 to 80, we'll say. So this is my story now, from starting in 74 to 80. During graduate school, I had a art history advisor named Jan van der Mark. He was a Dutch art historian, and he worked with Christo and a lot of the European conceptual artists. So I was educated by him. He was one of my grandfathers, I call him, intellectually, to know the tradition of European conceptual artists, Fluxus, Piero Manzoni, a lot of names you may not know. But as a graduate student, I was not interested in painting. I was interested in doing some crazy work. And so because I had porcelain skills, I started making instruments, which are here at the museum, out of porcelain. And I built musical instruments that I would perform in museums, in nature, wherever in alleys, wherever I decided to do it. And so I was fortunate enough to get a one-person show right out of graduate school at the Henry Gallery of the University of Washington. And I put together a show of my musical instruments and my scores, because I wrote the scores for my instruments. Couldn't play them without a score, obviously. And I put them up in this room. And during the opening, this young man walked up to me, got very close in my face, and he said, "I want to play this music." And I quickly thought, I'd never even thought about playing it. I was just making it as a young artist. And I quickly said, "You can't play it," because I knew he would break them, because they were porcelain. And he said, "Well, this music has to be heard." And I said, "I'll play it." And he said, "Well, we're having a concert at Evergreen College 1 month from now, and I want you to come and play the music." So I thought, oh shit, I've got to figure this out. So I went to Goodwill and I bought a black tuxedo coat with tails and a bow tie, and I took a big glob of red paint that had dried in my studio and put it on my lapel as a flower corsage. And I went to Evergreen and played this music. And I had never played it before. I had never rehearsed it. I just showed up and started playing it. And people went nuts. It was wild. And I just thought, holy smokes, this is cool. So I started playing it all over the place. And so what was I playing? I had these beautiful little porcelain bowls, and I had stones, and I had sponges, and I had rainwater. And I thought the way I could actually make the sponges sound is if I took rainwater and I moistened them, and then I played them with my mallets, you'd hear. And I thought, well, that's not totally interesting. So what if I take rainwater collected in the fall and play it, and then rainwater collected in the spring and play it? You could tell the difference, right? You obviously could. And so I played like the Four Seasons with rainwater. And then I built these beautiful boxes that I would collect the rainwater those different times a year. And so it made perfect sense since I was a scientist, and it was just very logical to me. So then I wanted to get outside because I thought, this is too easy in an art museum because everybody expects art and they expect it to be kind of wacky. So I built the sled, which is here, and I would drag that out in nature, and often nobody was there. It would be at dawn, except my Vanna White here with her camera. And so she took all these pictures, which is phenomenal. And I would start doing these performances out in ponds, and joggers would come by and they would slow down, and they'd go, "What is going on here?" And then I would stop and have a conversation with them about what is art. This is art. And we'd have these fabulous intellectual conversations about what is art. And so I did this all over the place, and I was getting more and more notorious. And so I had some friends that would go to Mexico a lot. So I took that box, which is again upstairs, to Mexico and did these wonderful performances on the beach. And what those white shafts are called skirrs, S-K-I-R-R. It's a real word, and that's what I named those. And what's cool about those particular drawings, those are ephemeral drawings, because I would put them in the sand, and the shadow would make a line, and then I'd put the next one at that point of the shadow, and I would create beautiful drawings. And as the world turns, is that the name of it? Anyway, they stole that from me. My mother watched As the World Turns all her life. As the world or the sun moved, the shadows would change and it would become an ephemeral drawing. So I formed an institute called ICEE, I-C-E-E, the Institute for the Conservation of Ephemeral Events. And that's what, what?
The box and come.
Oh, yeah, I told this a little earlier. So coming back from Mexico with that box into LA, Customs was another artwork because they were totally convinced. I foolishly wore my tuxedo. I looked like this guy here with that box. And they were convinced that I was smuggling some kind of narcotics into America. So they called the dogs and the red lights, and I had to go in a room with my box, and they tried to find where the substances were, which they never did. It was art, and they didn't believe me that it was art.
He stayed on the no-fly list for a long time.
Yeah, I had trouble. I had trouble flying for a while. So another piece, this is a wind instrument. It's upstairs. And I was conjuring the universe here. And this is when the top view is when it took me about 40 years later to realize that I wasn't an artist, just like I wasn't a doctor, but I was a cosmologist, and we'll get to that in a bit. So when Nancy was having her big chance with the Kauai Museum show, I got lucky because the Whitney had heard about me, and I got put into the Whitney Biennial in 1978. And Nancy was there, and she is proudly showing everybody that she took those pictures. Soundings. So this tray of rocks is upstairs, and they are tuned stones. And what I mean by that is if a stone has not been cut, it's a whole tone stone, obviously. And if you cut it, it becomes tuned. And unfortunately, I tuned 100 stones with a skill saw and never holding it in my hand, cutting them, and never had ear protection. So you'll notice that now I have hearing aids because the skill saw did a lot of damage to my hearing early on. But what a sounding is if you think about Mark Twain and ever did research into where Mark Twain took his name, it comes from riverboats. And on the front of a riverboat, somebody would stand with a weight and a line and throw it off the front of the boat to see what the depths were so they wouldn't run aground. And 2 meters was called Twain. And so the guy with the weight and the string would go, Mark Twain! That's 2 meters deep. And so Samuel Clemens liked that. And so that was how he got his name. Those are called soundings. Well, being a bright fellow that I was then, I thought, I'm going to take soundings, except I'm going to not go for the depth. I'm going for superficiality. So I recorded the splashes, and and made recordings for my music of the splashes. And so I decided to do 100 discrete sounding splashes in Puget Sound. And here's the grid right off of West Seattle, about a half-a-mile grid. And I would go out into the sound and take a splash and record the splash, and that became the recording. And my pal, I think you were my wife then. No, not yet. No.
I should have known.
She was on the shore with a Nikon on a tripod and taking a snap at every one of the locations. So as I rode across, she took a snapshot. And then when I went out one more, she took a snapshot. So there's the grid of the 100 sounding stones. So the Smithsonian heard about this piece, and they were doing a show at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C., called Harmonious Craft. And it was a show of musicians who built beautiful dulcimers and guitars and just gorgeous crafted instruments. And they thought, this piece should be in that show. So I sent it out there, and they liked it so much they put it right at the doorway. So when you would enter, there are 2 doors on each side. My piece was right in the middle, and you got to see that right up front. Well, I got a lot of mail about that show from dulcimer makers and guitar players who didn't think that should be in the show with their beautiful instruments. And that suited me just fine. And that show actually toured the United States for about 2 years. And when it came home, the photographs were gone. Somebody had lifted the photographs. So this is one of my last performance pieces before I moved on. So this is about 1980. And it was called A Passion Play, 12 Field Usages, and it was 12 hours long. It started at 6 a.m. in the morning. This one's going to load slowly. It's got to. So what it was is I built these boxes that were, and there's one here in the exhibition. They were lacquered boxes with leather straps that you could wear on your body. And sometimes each of the boxes would do different things to the body. For instance, sometimes you'd open the box and it would blind you with one eye, or sometimes it'd blind both eyes. And so each of the boxes had a different function, sort of a metaphysical function. And this was a journey from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., from dawn to dusk, from birth to death. This thread runs through my art continually, from James Joyce to all sorts of ideas of your life in a 12-hour cycle. And I repeat that through a lot of my work, and this piece was all about that. Again, Nancy took the pictures. I have a godchild here, Ava, whose mother, Mary Ann Peters, was the woman, the female part of this performance. And believe it or not, about 50 people showed up at 6 a.m. and stayed till 6 p.m. And the performances would last about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we would stop and drink and eat and talk, and then at the next hour it would happen again.
Tell them where it was, too.
It was performed in a pond in back at the Urban Horticulture back of the University of Washington. I love this piece, and it was a great stopping point for me. And then the real wedding happened in 1980. We got married and started living in that little house together. And I think we're going to go to Nancy's next 10 years is 1980 to 1990.
Tell us if we're getting too long-winded here.
Okay.
So the one on the left, as I mentioned, when you get out of art school, you have very limited resources. So I started making brown lines, which are called diazo prints. That was the way that architects would reproduce drawings. It was done on a photosensitized paper that developed in ammonia fumes. So I would take these images and expose them out in my backyard and develop the prints in a garbage can with ammonia that I gotten at the local drugstore. And so I made this whole series of pieces, and this piece particular here I was very honored, was on the poster with Frank Stella and all kinds of Rosenquist and all kinds of famous people for the 30 years of American printmaking out of the Brooklyn Museum. And the one on the right is one of the very last pieces I did that was flat work before I started actually committing myself to sculpture. Oops, here we go. So I went from doing the small glass pieces that I showed you were my first sculptures. In about a year, I went from making those small pieces. At that point, I had quit the picture framing business or the shop on University Avenue and started my own business called Artist Services. And I offered a service to mat and send flatworks, prints and drawings to all the national shows for artists in Seattle. They would sign me up to submit their work to 5 or 6 shows, and I would send it off in their name to Massachusetts or New York or wherever it was. And so in the process of that, they said, well, if you can, Matt, could you maybe start framing this? So I opened my own little picture framing business. And in that process, I started going to the big glass wholesalers to pick up my boxes of glass. And I walk into this back room. It was Hartung Glass, and they were the main distributor for all of Western Washington. And it was, I don't know, I'm going to exaggerate, 2 football fields worth of glass, all stacked up in these incredible piles of glass, plate glass that they did for all of the buildings. And I just was like, oh my God, it just hit me what a phenomenal material that was. And I started taking on little bits of glass and taught myself to cut glass. And at that point, I was gluing the glass together. And I went from the small pieces to the work I'd done for the Kauai show. Linda Ferris approached me and asked me to join the gallery. So I sort of very quietly worked, and I debuted my first show. It was called, what was it called? Oh, Support. Everything was 2 pieces. One was a braced version of a spine that was not braced, and then a braced version of the spine. And you can see that I only put this in not to show you that actually I used to be thin, but just to give you a scale, a sense of the scale of the pieces. Okay, there. So then I went in the mid-'80s, decided that I'm making sculpture. I was actually using sculpture as a 2-dimensional project. I wasn't learning, I had not learned actually to work in the round. So I then started hiring someone to do the welded armatures for me, and this is then a piece just to show you that I made jumps very quickly in those days. So these pieces are all the mid to late 80s. And this is more of my work. The piece here is at the Seattle Art Museum, and it was debuted the night it was announced that I got the Betty Bowen Award, which I'm not saying that to brag about. It was the first time that actually was given some money. And with that money, I went to the welding supply store to buy a welder. And I called Dennis, and I said, you know what? They have this new welder that is actually a welding machine for one kind of welding, a second kind of welding, and had what's called a plasma cutter, which actually cuts steel. And I called Dennis and I said, we have about $4,000 in our savings account. I'm wondering if it'd be okay if I used my Betty Bowen Award and our savings to buy this machine. And that's the beauty of being married to someone that shares your passion and shares your dreams and shares the priorities. So we wiped out our savings account and bought the welder, and I still have it today. I'm still using it. Your mom said, buy quality, it lasts. So these are the pieces of that. So I'm now starting to use the wall as a way I broke up drawings. So this is the work upstairs, is 1979. Oh, wait, no, I don't remember. Anyway, it's upstairs. I thought I should make some, it was very hard. Both of us had so much work, but being a sculptor, my work takes up so much room in the exhibit. Dennis could put a decade on the wall, but I thought that this was appropriate representation of what I was doing, the early work. Oops. So this is a piece that was called 7 Beauties, and it was shown at the last show at the Pavilion, the Seattle Art Museum Pavilion, and now is actually on permanent loan at the convention center. And it is taking my imagery of incorporating the goddess imagery with, again, the spines and the different bracing. And on the far end, you can see it was the very first photo sandblasted piece I did. I developed a technique of putting a photosensitized emulsion on glass, developing it out in the sunlight. We did this all at our house. Everything we've done almost up till now is at our studio houses. And with a contact print negative that's the same size, we'd run out into the sun. Dennis and I would carry the piece of glass. We'd run out in the driveway, expose it for 30 seconds, put a blanket over, and run it back in, take it all apart, and then we'd wash it out in high-pressure water on the side of our house, of the garage. And that was a process that was great, ideally great, but usually I got 1 out of 3 or 4 pieces to work, so. This is a body of work I was awarded a show at the Seattle Art Museum that I shared with Joey and Flora and Billy Morris. And this was a piece, both pieces are now in a museum in Switzerland. They were purchased from the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Lausanne. Oh, no. So this is one of the views of the show. I made a room within the room, and there was 2 anchor pieces, 2 pieces in the middle, and then 8 singular columns around the room. And I don't know why I went to this one so fast. What year are we?
Still 80s and 90s.
Okay. Could tell I don't. I was asked to be an artist in residence, and the phone call came. It's kind of like getting the Nobel Prize. They don't realize in Europe that it's actually 2 in the morning on the West Coast. So I ran for the phone, and this wonderfully, very accented French woman said, I'd like to invite you to be an artist in residence at the Chateau Béchevel in Bordeaux, France. And they had invited 7 artists from around the world, from each different country, to come and live at the chateau and to make a body of work. And the only requirement was you had to make a body of work that they assigned. And the chateau had been purchased by a very big insurance company in France and Suntory whiskey in Japan. And they renovated the beautiful old chateau. And part of their goal was to make an international arts center. And they decided that the theme that all cultures share was the 4 cardinal virtues. So I'm not going to, obviously, my year was justice. And it was a friend that was there with me said it's very, very French, the way they ran it. They had a symposium, and we had the director of the Picasso Museum there, and the director of the physics department, and the director of the Italian museum in Milan. And we had about 5 days of them explaining what they thought was justice. And I had a translator with me, but mostly I doodled because I didn't understand a lot of what they were saying. And about the 5th day, they showed me where I could be my studio, and they gave me a renovated grain storage building that was actually 2 floors, and they had just finished remodeling it. I was going to be the first artist in this space. And they opened these huge wooden doors that were 2 stories tall, and they had beautiful forged hinges, and they said, would you like this studio? And I opened the door, and I said, oh my God, I had this most overwhelming sense. It had just smelled like new stone and new masonry. And it was just this phenomenal. And I'm not very mystical. And I thought, this is an incredible space. So I had taken all my drawing materials, and the idea was that you actually made contemplative work. You had any equipment to make work there. You were to make thinking work. And if you were approved your project, then you were invited. You went back to your home country, made the work, and then was shipped back for the show at Béchevel. So the days I spent, the first few days there, I started doing the similar drawings to the ones I showed you with a hand, but I started doing great big body drawings. And I was just haunted by this. I kept wanting to make work because I knew I didn't have to, no one was going to see it, no dealer had to approve of it, no one had to buy it. I was just going to get to make work for myself. And I'm really basically a painter, and Dennis is basically a sculptor. He makes paintings and I make sculpture. So it was like this always struggle. And about the 4th day in my studio, I just had this haunting sense of bodies swinging on the wall. And I couldn't get away from it. It was so dark. And it was, for me, I did not want to do that work. So finally, I just said, screw it. I got to make this work. So I did 17 drawings of these pieces. And I came back to Seattle. I did, excuse the pun, but I executed 5 of the pieces. And to give you an idea of scale, the pieces here are on the glass are 8 feet tall. So, and they were shown back in my original studio in Paris, or in Bordeaux. It was a very phenomenal body of work for me because I got to be true to what I wanted to do without any consideration of the marketplace. Not that I ever did that much, but at some point, people are always seeing your work. So the piece on the right is 12 feet big, 12 feet tall. Coming here. Oops. We put the two. It's moving, sorry. These are very big images. I made a mistake of putting. So I came back from the show. I took a year to make the work, and then the work was there for a year. And I just had this desire to make something beautiful. And I started making the series that I called the Botanical Series. And it was a complete reaction to actually dwelling in this darkness for 3 years. And I started making these pieces of glass that I would just arrange like floral arrangements. And they were just sort of so lighthearted. And I got to actually make them at a scale that were accessible to me to be able to build them, I could, unlike most of my work, I have to have it pre-planned. There's no going, I don't get to go revise something. When it comes out of the kiln, that's it. And so I thought, I made it a scale that if I didn't like it, it was not an investment of too much time. So I started these series, this is my 4 seasons, spring, autumn, fall, and winter. And then those pieces then became much larger. Come on. Okay. So now these are about 8 feet tall. And I just loved making these, and I'm still making them. There's one piece in the show upstairs. But they were just joyful, and they actually then got to explore different processes for me. Oh, we sure went fast. We're skipping ahead.
That's good.
Is that good? These are a little out. Uh-oh.
That's where you want to be.
No, it was, okay. So this is a body of work I did, and actually probably still going to do it. I plan sculptures. I'll plan 20 or 30 in a fit of creativity, and I always work in watercolors. I do watercolors that are 2 inches per foot per scale, and I literally have hundreds of proposed sculptures just that I've not been able to make. So this is called the reconstructions. What I did is I took common myths, common fables, and dissected them, took them apart, and remade them. So this is I forget, one of the Venuses. Sorry, I can barely see it. But I think this is it, though. Sorry. So these are, again, very large scale, and most of them are in museums now. It was not very eloquent. I'm sorry. Come on.
Okay.
I could talk better about the other pieces.
So this is the 80s to 90s. That was in general and roughly chronological for Nancy. I got tired of having my tuxedo wet, and I was having a lot of fun with my performance work, but I wanted you, the viewer, to experience what I was experiencing. So I started building installations in museums, and I did that for 10 years. So the first one was at Linda Ferris Gallery in Seattle, and I took the entire gallery and had several rooms, so you would have to enter the place and go through that copper thing, and there was something moving inside, and the floor was full of salt. And it was an adventure for the viewer. And I did several of these. This was done at the Portland Art Museum. And you would come in over there where that doorway is, over a little bridge, into a room that had a lot of flowers and organic materials. So slowly over the course of the month, it started to rot, and you would smell the decay of things. And then I did a piece in New York at the new museum piece called A Pharmacy. The most important part about this piece is that I brought in 4,000 pounds of salt, and on the floor there was about 12 inches of salt, which sounds like, who cares? But what happens when you put that much salt in a room is it dries it out, and you instantly, when you walk in the room, get a dry mouth. And you start realizing there's something going on that's a little different. And that black device was on a turntable, so it totally swung, and it would come within 6 inches of the walls. So you continually, when you're in the room, had to be aware of yourself, and you're standing in salt, and your mouth is getting dry, craving a margarita. And so those are the types of concerns I would have. And this piece was called The Seven Halls of Adam and Eve. And that's a plan view, that blue figure. It looks like a person with their arms out. And it was a 50-foot long condo that I built at the Seattle Art Museum. And you would enter it through the feet, or doorways here and here. And these hallways would lead into all these rooms. And you would exit out one of the ears at the top. So it was 7 installation rooms. And these were huge endeavors costing tens of thousands of dollars. And this was a seminary, a piece that we did at the Whatcom County Museum. I did with Keith Beckley, Jeffrey Bishop, and Nancy. So it was an early collaboration. Anyway, those pieces cost a lot of money. And the museums would often give you maybe $5,000 to do an installation, and we would spend 10. And then after the 6 weeks or a month after the show, I'd load it in the van, take it to the dump, throw it away. Because what are you going to do with all that stuff? Just clogs up your life. So one day, I and Nancy had a realization that the wolf was at the door. And we didn't want to have our day jobs anymore. And we wanted to be professional artists and earn our keep. And so from 1990 to 2000, we realized all fame and no fortune doesn't feed the cat. And so I quit my teaching job. I taught at the Bush School for 15 years, teaching art to kids, which was one of the greatest jobs you could ever have. What can go wrong? Facetiously, he says. And Nancy closed her picture framing business, and we practice that you eat what you kill. And so we began making art that we could sell without compromising, because we still had pure hearts about making pure art, and I didn't want to paint parrots and tulips. I wanted to make real art, but try to get somebody to buy it. So this first piece of mine was called The 72 Faces of God. And I painted 72 little paintings depicting the deities from every culture around the world. And it was a Joseph Campbell tour de force. And it was shown at the Linda Ferris Gallery. And 2 days before it opened, Microsoft bought the whole show, all 72 pieces. But don't think that they were great because they've deaccessioned the piece. They said it was too religious for them. They kept it for about 15 years, and then they said it's too religious, so they got rid of it. So Nancy, we're going to flip back and forth now.
These are a little out of chronological order. At that point, we took any job that we could, anything that came down the pike we applied for. We did libraries and hospitals, and I told someone this evening that 85% of my work at that time was commission work, because sculpture is often placed in homes, but they can't buy the piece that's available, so they say, I'd like to have a piece that would fit in this space. So I did a lot of that work. And this was the last piece I made, is a commissioned piece at the Pierce College at Puyallup, a junior college at the library. And the community at the college had been very burned by an artist installation conceptual piece, quote, 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 that they'd commissioned right when the college was built. So when I applied, I was a 5-state competition, and I won it. And when I went down there, they had their knives out. They were just so sure that I was going to really jerk them around and give them something that they didn't want. And at the end of Happily Sane, that was, I think, 32 years ago or 28 years ago, it's still up. We went down there to photograph it. And the librarian came out, and just almost tears in her eyes. She said, I come into work every day. I love this piece. It means so much to the community. And what I did is I took all the models. I'm going to go, yeah. I took all the models from the community, and it was the seven, give me help. The seven,
The 7 liberal arts.
I'm having stage fright, I guess. 7 liberal arts: arithmetic, rhetoric, logic. And so these are all full scale. They're 80 inches tall. And they hung around the perimeter of the room. And so the photographs were of the people from the community. And this is geometry, astronomy, and music. And this was woman that was one of the elders of the Puyallup tribe. And this was a English as a second language, wonderful woman from India. And when Dennis and I did all the photographs, they came to my studio and we had a photo. And her husband came and she was so scared because she'd not been on her own and obviously going to be photographed. And it turns out that she was so scared, she wrote later that she'd almost not come that day. And I think it's one of my favorite pieces. And then this is one of the people in the PR department at the school in the library. This is my favorite one. Come on. This was our sanitation engineer, otherwise known as our garbage man, in the middle. And I asked him because I really wanted, he was a wonderful, wonderful charisma. And I thought he captured the beauty of what I felt was the process of learning and integration into culture. And when he came to the studio to be photographed, his 2 kids came. And I said, oh my God, this is just perfect. And so we photographed them together. And this is the very first books I made, the very first glass books. And you see there's a lot of glass books in my life after this. But when we had the grand opening for the piece, he and 35 members of his family came down to the opening. And it's still, it was everything I wanted it to be. It was everything public art should be. It was me actually having the voice I wanted to have, but also having the voice of the people that are in the community and the voice of the people viewing it. So it was, I think, it was a great way to exit I think that was my last piece, but I did. Okay.
Okay, I did this piece. It was called The 7 Libraries of Babylon, and it started a trend in our house doing libraries. And you're probably getting the feeling now why we love libraries. We love knowledge and we love the liberal arts. And so what's important about this and the wolf is that these were giant paintings. You can see like big long things, which obviously no one could buy. Why was I doing that? But what happened is somebody saw these paintings and commissioned me to do the history of information from the caves to the computer. And I did it for Novell Computer Systems. And the painting was 54 feet long. And it was hanging in the headquarters in San Jose, California. So, and then the Seattle Library System had a call for artists. And I won, it was the Carnegie Libraries. And they wanted some art for there's 5 Carnegie Libraries in Seattle. And so I won the commission and did 10 paintings. These are 8 of the 10. Again, dealing with the liberal arts, rhetoric, grammar, geometry, astronomy, arithmetic. And they hang 2 each in all the 5 libraries in Seattle.
I'm just going to, this is the work that still excites me the most. These were all pieces done in the 90s, and I think that I really started to actually become a sculptor. They were seen in the round. All the pieces were, again, very large, 7, 8, 10 feet tall. And the photo imagery here was what I'm particularly known for, and it was, I think, from the shutterbug to this, it was a wonderful journey. And each time, I've always felt that both of us had the process of having an idea, a content, then a way to express it, and it usually involved learning a new skill or a new craft or a new media. And being able to render these photographs at this scale was quite a feat for me. So most of these now are in public collections. This one's at Microsoft, and this one is private, and this one was at Safeco. And again, this is work that still I thought that I was doing exactly what my heart and my soul wanted to do, but then I found a willing audience and willing patronage. I think was a really, I think, a wonderful gift from our community that we've actually been supported all along, no matter kind of what crazy ideas we wanted to do. So at the time, all of these pieces, and this piece is on the far right, is in the show. That piece was selected to represent the United States at the Greek American Embassy in Athens during the first Athens Olympics, and it stayed there for 2 years. Came home in crates and boxes, and it was only unearthed 20 years later for this show. And all of the wrapping, all the plastic had great big Greek letters. All the tape was all wrapped in Greek letters. And this piece here, I wanted to point out this work that I was talked into taking a blacksmithing class about 25 years ago at University of Washington. It turns out it was blacksmithing for jewelers, and everybody was doing pieces about this big. And I noticed there was a very large hammer, a hydraulic hammer, that had been purchased from the Volvo factory in Sweden and given to the University of Washington sculpture department. And there I am going, I'm not interested in doing 6-inch pieces. I don't want to do the really tough scale. And I've always felt that as a small woman that I had to make bigger, heavier, more complicated pieces so I could play with the big boys and be taken seriously. It took a long time to realize that it didn't matter what scale it was. If it was good sculpture, it could be 12 inches or 12 feet. So all of these pieces then, so I talked them into letting me use this big hammer. And at the time, there was this young man who eventually became our studio assistant. Paul Casey was the TA there. And between Paul and the stupidity of the person in charge of it, let me start using this huge hammer. So you heat the metal up to about, well, it's so it's bright cherry red, and you put it in this huge, thousands of pounds, 2 anvils coming together, and pound it together, and you have about 30 seconds before it cools down. So I developed these techniques and actually then did these huge forged pieces here. All these pieces were all done during that era. And this is in the show. It's probably one of my favorite pieces I ever made. It was sold right away to a law firm. And then it was borrowed and shown in a one-person show I had on Cheating Coals, and we used on the poster. And it went back to the law firm, and the law firm then went bankrupt. And instead of selling all of their work in Seattle, they shipped it to San Francisco. And I heard about it, and so I thought, I want that piece back. So I called in live to the auction, and I won the piece back. And a very dear friend of ours was down doing an antique show, and I said, gee, John, do you think I could pay your crew whatever to get it back to Seattle? And so lo and behold, it came back to our studio, and I now own it. So it's double-sided, as you can see, but again, it was the beautiful blacksmithing. I felt that there was always a need for me to combat the beauty of my material. It's so seductive and it's so beautiful, but I was also attracted to how dangerous it is and how it conveys so many different emotions in people. But I always felt that all the metal work up until the blacksmithing work didn't entail the beauty and the fluidity that I wanted it to counterpoint to the glass, and it was with the blacksmithing. I felt that there was a real sign of final kind of the period at the end, or the exclamation at the end of the work. We saw that. Why are we going? Okay. Okay, I'm trying to get to you. Oh. Just again, one of the examples of different materials I got to explore. This is quilted maple. It's just the side of a tree, and I was very fortunate and worked with a cabinet maker here in town that actually, I would give him the drawings and he would execute them. There's very little we don't do in the studio. All the cast bronze, I make the waxes for them. They're sent to a small foundry in Monroe. And all the carved pieces, you haven't seen them yet. The water jet services does that, but those are the only two actual, and the woodworking that we don't do in their studio. There we go. There we go. I put this piece in. Again, it was a very strong piece. It was bringing back to the metaphor of the human body being encased. It's called Encased in Your Beliefs. And it was the strength of all the different materials that I was enjoying at the moment, but it had, I think, a more profound visual impact than sort of the beautiful pieces. This was a very, in a sense, it was questioning also the same reason why I made the Justice series. And this piece was used on a book cover out of the Harvard Press called Capitalism in Post-America. And I thought, that's a very good title for it. So, again, what? Had nothing to do with it, but that book cover. So again, I got this piece back. It was sold, and then the person couldn't pay their storage bills, and I ended up buying it back out of storage. Okay, I think I'm finished there. Okay. We're coming to an end, don't worry.
So we've broken the rule of 50 minutes, so we're going to speed up a little bit. It's getting, you guys will be starving if we keep going. All right. I wasn't fishing for that, but we started working together. We've always shared a studio, and because we live in our studio, and we shared studio assistants. And so often our dealers would say, gosh, your two works look so good together. Let's have you both in a show. We'd have a two-person show. And our works do look good together. You can just see upstairs. So we did 4 collaborations together. One was called After the Deluge.
Can I interrupt you here?
What? You want to tell that story?
Go ahead. No, you go step up.
So now the bickering starts because we're talking about the collaborations. So I'll talk about that, and then Nancy can tell you about the deluge. So I was starting a piece called After the Deluge, where you would have to rebuild a society after an apocalypse or something. How would you do that? You'd need these archetypes. You'd need a physician. You'd need a master gardener. You'd need a calendar keeper. You'd need a holy man. I had a whole list of 12 different archetypes that you would need. 15. And I was working on them joyfully up in the studio. And then at night, we have a place that we sit and drink wine out in the back of our house. It was summertime. And Nancy came out and she said, "What are you doing?" I told her what I was doing. She said, "I want to do that."
No, I said, you're having more fun than I am.
Yeah. So I said, "Why don't I'll make an alchemist, a physician, and then you make one. With your sensibility." And so we did that show together. And a lot of the pieces are here together, and they're put together. You'll see a water carrier and her water carrier. And one of the aspects of that show is that I wrote fables about each of those archetypes. And those are in the catalog. And we have the catalogs for you to take home if you want. And
I don't think we have enough, so
they can fight over them.
yeah.
No, we'll sell them. No, anyway. So we did these shows together. And this was, I don't know which show this was. But the second show was called The Sultan's Library.
Tell we're getting tired.
And the conceit was the Sultan was building a new library, and he had nothing in it. So he called all his minions into the room, and he said, "Go out into the world and bring back for my library things that no one else has, and we'll put them in my library." And we thought, that's a great idea. And what we did with that idea is we also wrote stories of where they found these objects, and we built crates for the objects. So when we put the show up, we had the object. See if we can get a picture of that.
It's the next slide, yeah.
Yeah. So we showed the crates. The crates were actually beautifully made. They had labels for the Sultan. And
The Sultan had his own shipping company, his own airlines.
all the shipping company built labels, we built invoices. It was really a thorough concept. And that show, our dealer said, people won't leave. They would come into the show. It was like going to a 3-hour movie. They'd come in and they'd read everything and they'd look at the crates and look at the objects. It was really a successful show, and we had a blast doing it. And then we came upon the last one, which we did 2 different ways. And it was called Prospero's Library and Prospero's Books. So Prospero might ring a bell to you. Shakespeare, The Tempest. Prospero was the Duke of Milan, and he got in trouble, and his brother,
Alfonso.
maybe that was his name, threw him off the island. Maybe, I don't know if it was. Anyway, he said, "You got to get out of here. We're going to get rid of you,
Yeats.
Prospero." And Prospero was the king or something of Milan, and he was also a magician. And so his brother put him in a boat with his daughter Miranda, and luckily he gave Prospero all his books, put him in the boat, and they went off to the island where the tempest happened. And so we, one night, drinking wine, said, a lot of wine, said, we ought to do a story about Prospero's library. And so we started, and we made books out of glass, books out of porcelain, books out of lead. We told the story. We imagined that Prospero's library would be one of the most fantastic places in the world because magical, whimsical, and so it was. And we did one show in Sun Valley, and then we did a very elaborate one in Seattle. And that one just sort of broke the spell because we haven't collaborated since that show. So now we live in a neighborhood called Utopian Heights, and we named it Utopian Heights because it is utopia where we live. We have studios. We live in a big house with studios full of art, everybody else's art. We have a lot of art by all of the people we love, all the artists we know. And then we make art on the third floor in the basement, and all the art lives in the middle. But we also have a house across the street where there's a garden, and it's called the Garden for All Souls, and she's going to tell you about that in a minute. But Utopian Heights is a place you all are welcome to visit sometime. And it is, you'll see why it's called Utopian Heights. Now, she's going to tell you about the garden.
And he'll tell you another story about how it came to being with the city. So Dennis and I bought this house across the street. A wonderful neighbor had gone into assisted living, and we realized I was still welding in the small little welding shop across the street from this house, and I realized our neighborhood was really getting kind of Gucci, and I thought that there's going to be a time when a young family moves in, has a new baby, and I'm going to be grinding steel right there in the middle of the day, and the city's going to come around and shut me down. They won't say, this is a craft studio. No, this is a fabrication studio. So we bought the house and had decided that we fixed it up and a person rented it. And very soon before that, we used to drink a lot. We would sit in the garden and we'd say, well, I've been making these sculptures that were suitable for outdoors, but they were always being shown in the rarefied gallery experience with a snotty girl sitting at the desk looking down on you when you came in, and then people saying, well, I can't see this in my yard. It has to go into a beautiful reflecting pond. So we decided we would build a sculpture garden that made use of an actual garden in an actual neighborhood. And so we planned it, and the night that the little bulldozer was delivered, we woke up to the Twin Towers being bombed. And I always get upset. So we sat in front of the TV like the rest of the world until about noon. Dennis just stood up, and I tell the story the same way, still so poignant. He stood up and he hit his hands on his thighs and he said, enough of this violence. Let's start something beautiful today. So the bulldozer got revved up and we started clearing the land, and that's how the garden came into being. It's called the Garden for All Souls, and it was the birth of my whole series of work, that the art, the outstretched arms and the lamentations. So that is the beginning of this work. Oh. So as pieces would sell, I would just make another piece.
It was a blackberry patch in a backyard of this little house across the street that we had just purchased. And so we slowly built little rooms and planted. We have about 30 different varieties of Japanese maples, and we have beautiful sculpture. And as we built it, I would come home and I would say, I need a piece for this room that we're building today. And she would say, well, I don't have one. And I'd say, well, make one. And so she would. She made one. And so slowly.
Never paid me.
It's true. It's true. So it's a beautiful garden to this day, and it has treated us very lovingly, both financially and spiritually. And before, we had to put up gates eventually because the insurance company told us we can't insure that because a kid's going to tip over a sculpture and then sue you. So we put up a garden gate that says you can go in private garden. But before we did that, people would drive up and go into the garden and stay for a long time. And one night, about 9 o'clock, it was the summertime, so it was still light, a car drove up and a woman in surgery scrubs got out of her car, a nurse, obviously, went in the garden, and she was there till 11 o'clock. And I finally went over there to see what was going, and I asked her if she was okay. She said, I just had the most terrible day, and I needed to come to this garden. And that's what that garden is all about. So this is the future, and I'm gonna lead it off, and then Nancy's gonna tell you about her future. So on 2012, on the 4th of July, I couldn't sleep. I had gotten up to go to the restroom, and I'd gone back to bed. And I have a little earbud to help me go to sleep, and I was listening to the BBC. And they announced that the physicists at CERN, Switzerland, had found evidence of the Higgs boson. And I knew enough from my science background, which I've never given up, that that was a big deal. And I grabbed Nancy's leg and I said, oh my God. She goes, what's wrong? Are you having a heart attack? And I waited a few years to have that heart attack. But I said, no, I'm not. But I've just heard the rest of my life's work. And so from that day forward, I am making art about not the Higgs boson, but about creation, about what we're all about. And the end of the story is that we're just stardust particles with consciousness. And that is a fascinating topic for me. And that's what my work is about nowadays. And so this was a piece that's at the University of Washington right now. It's theirs. And it's the history of the universe from the Big Bang to the end of time. And these are some of the pieces from this cosmological series that I'm working on now. This is upstairs, one of my favorite of all time.
There's such big images.
Yeah. Oh, the chunks of matter on this are porcelain, and they're raku fired. And this is the last piece I'm going to show you, and it's upstairs. And this is pretty fascinating, so I'm going to tell you in detail. What happens at CERN, Switzerland right now is that there is a giant machine that we Homo sapiens have created. It's big as a cathedral, and it's buried 100 feet underground. And it's a giant collider for particles. And it goes 27 kilometers. There's a particle collider where physicists send protons in opposite directions at 99.99999 the speed of light. And they collide 100 million per second when they're running this, 100 million per second. And energy turns into matter because we know E equals mc squared, right? We believe that, it's true. And c is just the speed of light, so it's a constant. We can just throw that out. And so energy equals mass. And we, Homo sapiens, are creating mass with the energy. I guess the lights dim when it's running at CERN because there's so much energy. But what happens is billions, millions of particles get created, and they're flying around, And we have learned to track those arcs, and we can say, ooh, that's a muon. Ooh, that's a tau. Ooh, that's a Higgs boson. Well, that's fascinating to me, and that's what I'm painting. And that's what I'm making my art about these days.
This bodywork started in the Sultan's library, and then I started getting overdue notices for all the books I was making, all those glass books, hundreds and hundreds of books. And I had made probably 30 drawings for this series of work that I call the Earth Grid Markers. There is a superstition that you take the 5 Platonic forms and put them in a sphere, where the edges of those Platonic forms hit the sphere, i.e. the earth. There is a mystical belief that those were sacred spots. So I have made those drawings and am now in the process of actually figuring out how to make them. Over the course of the 12 years that they've been being made, I've gotten a lot older, and so has my studio assistants, and we're trying to figure out a way that I can make sculptures that weigh 300 and 400 pounds. So there's a large body of work of these that I'm not showing, but that's what's keeping my interest alive. And I'm very much looking forward to figuring out how I'm actually going to make this next body of work, to have the scale that I want, but to be able to be made in our small little studio experience. So I think that's it then.
So we can't make art the way we do and how much we make alone. And we've had studio assistants from right the beginning. One of them is sitting right here in the third row, Stephanie.
Wave, Stephanie.
And Stephanie worked for us for 13 years. And then she had the person sitting next to her daughter,
Wave,
so
Lily.
she had to leave us. So anyway,
Went to college this year.
these are our studio assistants, Paul Casey, Andre Sampson, who started working for us in 1982. He's 66 years old, and he still works for us.
That's why we're trying to figure out how to make these sculptures be a little lighter, my sculptures.
Go next
Okay.
slide. Next.
Paul Casey in the middle. He was a master metalsmith.
Got to point that at the back.
Oh, that's how it works. Dear
Okay.
me.
So we missed this photo slide. One more person needs to be.
Oh, yeah.
This is Spike Mafford, Michael Spafford's son, and he's our photographer and our nephew, and he's an important part of our family. The helpers that work for us are part of the family. Okay. And then here we are. Some of you know, but I paint with all my surfaces, and this is not important to my art at all, but they're encaustic, which means they're beeswax. All the surfaces upstairs are beeswax with pigment burnt in with a torch. And then
There I am with my tools.
okay. So the highlight of every artist's life is to have a retrospective. And so here's our retrospective, and we have 2 books, mine and Nancy's. And Nancy's book is just out. It was printed. Mine was first printed. They're both written by Matthew Kangas, designed by Phil Kovacevic, and printed in Italy. And Nancy's just arrived from Italy on Monday, and it's
In customs.
in customs right now. So there are no books to buy from hers, but
But there will be plenty of books in the gift shop here, and they'll be available on Amazon. But all of the proceeds from our books go to BIMA, the ones here. So try to buy it here.
So here we are, 2 bickering old artists in our home, and that's the end of the story. Questions?
went way over. Sorry.
Yeah. I heard from a docent that the glass that you use comes from Edward Drummond Libby. Is that Libby glass? Libby of Ojai, California?
No, it's not. I'm trying to think Libby Owens Ford is what you're seeing, LOF. And it was, the West Coast production was outside of Stockton, California. And I would buy it through Hartung Glass here. But then when I started buying, my cases I buy 2,000 to 6,000 pounds at a time. And the pieces are 4 feet by 8 feet. And I got to know the chemist. There was a point where everything was going wrong in the firings. My kilns are huge, they're 8 feet long, and everything was coming out kind of chalky white. So I called down to the chemist down there and the engineer, and they said, well, come down, send some of the samples, and we'll try to figure out what's going on. Well, it turns out that my batch, I had the batch number on the side of the crate. It turns out their kilns had failed, and they'd opened up these huge, they're bigger than this, three times the size of this room, and oxygen had gotten into that great big huge smelter, and so it had put a chemical reaction on the glass, and my kiln was mimicking the reaction, and that was causing the surface to turn white. So I went through all this extravagant things of pumping neutral air and all this kind of stuff, and nothing worked. And my dear friend had said, well, you know, Nancy, we've just come home from Bali, all of us. She said, you have not been making the proper offerings to the kiln god. So there I went, being a picture framer, built a wonderful little shrine. Every time I fire a kiln, I take a piece from that piece, a little piece of glass, and I make an offering to my kiln. I go, and it's worked ever since.
Plus, she kills a chicken and runs around the house.
My kiln draws 160 amps, the normal house is 200, and up until my latest kiln build, I've had 3 different builds, the lights on the street lamps would dim.
That's true.
Yeah,
Story.
we were always worried that cops would come thinking we were growing marijuana, but they just had to look up our names and see that actually what we did, so. Oh.
Yep, back there.
Do you guys wake up in the middle of the night and have a sketchbook by your bed? The general idea is that you carry a sketchbook around for these sculptures or to get them down right away, or how does that process start with drawing?
I just roll over and hope I can go back to sleep. No,
The great thing about living in your studio is, yes, the answer is yes. When I was younger, I would get up and go up to my studio and look at what I had been doing that day. And I've always had belief in the power of the mind and my dreams. And so when I was younger, I used to preload my subconscious at night thinking about a problem that I have in my studio. And I called it the 3 a.m. seminar. And in fact, I solve to this day a lot of my problems, both outside of the studio problems and inside the studio problems at 3 a.m. when I get up to go to the bathroom. And then I get back in bed and I'm not quite going to sleep, but I'm kind of semi-conscious. I will find solutions to problems, but I don't draw them. I to this day just start making work.
I have a different work method. I will go to my studio and I'll put on either opera music or country western music, go figure, and I will just, the notice is the do not disturb, and I will start maybe 5 or 6 days of very generative work, and I will actually sketch it, and then when the pieces that are coming in to maturing, then I will make these drawings that are actually, we build sculptures from my drawings. I'm sorry I didn't include any in the show, but then that body of work might take me 2 years. That 5 days of inspiration will take me 2 years to start actually to go through it. And that's why I would say 3/4 of my work has never been made. It's just not enough time to do it.
I think we should all go have a glass of wine. And thank you.
Thank you. You've been great. I've been very nervous about this, so thank you very much.